So John Oliver certainly got it right, but without people like Rajendra Pachauri, Governor Schwarzenegger, Mary Nichols, we couldn't make the transition from knowing there's a problem to knowing there's a solution to the problem, and that's really what I want to focus my comments on for you today. When we talk about what we've learned about the climate story, from sea level rise to fires to droughts to impacts on biodiversity, on species, it is a daunting story of problems. And in fact, the title that I was accurately given for these comments is, How Dangerous is the Situation? How Vulnerable Are We? And in fact, there's been a series of reports that have begun to swing the needle back to exactly what Governor Schwarzenegger said in 2006, and that is the scientific consensus is in, but the action sequel, climate change making a difference, still needs to be written and to be filmed, and that's what we're all doing today. And so when we look at the reports that have come down the line, from the business as usual path that we were on, to the World Bank, where I worked for a year, saying 4 degrees is unacceptable, to what we know scientifically, half of that is unacceptable, we move to a process where we're not only seeing climate change disasters looming in front of us, but we're now seeing them today. This is a picture from Science magazine highlighting 570 vents on the seafloor off the east coast of the United States, where we're seeing methane bubbling out of the ground because the temperature pressure difference is changing as we warm the water. These are not stories that are going to come up in a future action movie. These are things we have to terminate today. So we have right now ample evidence that climate change is affecting us now. We have report after report, as John Oliver highlighted, in terms of how grim the situation is when one climate denier can hold sway in a quote-unquote one-on-one debate. The science community has an obligation to make much clearer not only that we are facing a series of issues, and Peter Glick will highlight some of the issues around sea level rise, another critical issue because so much of our U.S. and California and global infrastructure are on the coasts. But we have to highlight where this story has a transition into a series of positive, job-creating, environmental justice promoting steps to invest in those areas where we know we can make a difference. And in fact, when you take that perspective, and I'll use my comments today to highlight that, the story doesn't look anywhere near as hard or as dire. It takes commitment and coordination, and that's exactly what you've seen in all the comments. In fact, if you look in your brochure, you will see California hasn't just passed AB 32, this landmark law on climate change, but a whole series of supporting legislations. We have a standard for clean energy, our RPS. We have a carbon market. We have SB 375 that requires us to look at vehicle miles traveled as a function of planning decisions. All of these pieces demonstrate you can put the story together. And so when I look at all of these very worrisome and very accurate scientific studies, and by the way, that report that came out on the 97%, I'm very pleased to say that was in a journal for which I'm the editor-in-chief, Environmental Research Letters, a place where we get sued regularly by those climate deniers for highlighting the message. When you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, these IPCC documents, the latest one, AR5, has just come out, what you see is the path we're on, that red path, that's the business as unusual, the business as we cannot accept path. Making the blue path reality, that's what California's been about, that's what Portugal, Germany, Denmark, Korea, the climate leaders are all about making happen. And the most important message, in my opinion, for you all to take away today is that we have a growing stable of job-creating, low-cost opportunities to green our economy. We will always have these battles to be fought, as Governor Schwarzenegger highlighted, but these are all things we have to fight as retrograde battles, defending solid, economically performing opportunities to move forward. So when I look at the picture of where we're going, one of the features that my laboratory has been engaged in is to build a series of models of energy systems around the country. We started off, of course, building a model of California's energy economy. We then built it for all the western states, Western Canada and Mexico, that are tied together in a power pool. We've recently released versions of this model called Switch for China, for Chile. We'll be introducing one for India in a bit. And across all of these very different market structures, places where different fuels are subsidized or not, the message comes off in a very, very clear way. And that is, there's a whole wide range of scenarios, all of which get us to this 2 degrees C, this less risky, not entirely risk-free, but this less risky 2 degrees C pathway. In each of these different parts of the world, there are a wide range of economic opportunities to make this path happen. And so I'll highlight just a series of these different scenarios. One where natural gas prices raise. One where we meet the federal goal of having solar cost $1 a watt, a target that we're on the path of. Another one where the price of nuclear and the adoption of nuclear is high. Another one where there is no nuclear. All of these are different scenarios, all of which make that target. And in fact, consistently, the price of power barely rises any differently from that we'd expect just based on inflation. And I want to highlight that part of the story. As we look ahead, in each of these parts of the world, we have systems that are dominated largely by oil, by gas and coal today. But as we move from 2020 to 2030 to 2050, in each of these cases, we find that there are viable paths, and what they all require is a very simple equation. And that is, if you coordinate what your government agencies do, and you send a clear message to the private sector saying, we are on a path to decrease our emissions down to that 80% below the 1990 level by 2050. In all of these cases, there are workable scenarios where the price of power is barely different than it would have been without these policies, plus you get a whole host of benefits. More jobs created by investing in this clean energy systems, dramatically improved urban air quality that affects all people and directly addresses one of the big issues in this field, and that is environmental justice has to be a central part of the story. The most important message in AR4, the fourth assessment, was that global warming will most strongly and most quickly affect the global poor. It didn't say the poorest countries. It said anywhere from inner city Oakland to inner city Mumbai. Those are the people who will most directly be affected. The people living most on the margins are most left out of this equation. So if you don't adopt a clean energy strategy for your home, city, country, region, you are committing a clear piece of environmental injustice. And it's one that will come back to cost us and already cost us in many ways. So when I look at this sort of snapshot of images, the one scenario that stands out as more expensive than all the others is if we fail to continue to do what California's done since 1970s, and that is to continue to be a leader in energy efficiency. High cost of solar or wind or low cost of this, that, all those scenarios work, but if we don't keep energy efficiency at the center of our agenda, we make our life difficult and we make our choices more expensive. And that's why California's commitment to making efficiency job one, clean energy right on its heels, that's a strategy that wins this overall picture. And that's the piece that we have to keep central to the conversation. We just released a version of this model for China. A feature of the story is that we see China going from a coal-dominated world today to solar and storage-dominated if we can keep innovating as fast as we've been going in terms of making solar technologies less expensive, generating more and more energy efficiency options, more and more ways to store that energy. That's a transformative picture. My last comments, however, are that we have left out, largely in the country and to some extent in California, making the clean energy proposition one that works for individuals. One thing we were asked to do by Governor Schwarzenegger's administration was to build a carbon calculator so individuals could look at what is their footprint, what are the opportunities to save. So when we look at this across the country, we see the map, green is good and red is bad in this picture, as you'd expect. We see carbon dioxide emissions by zip code, but now we can zoom in. Big data really does buy us some benefits. When we look at carbon dioxide emissions for each zip code, by kilowatt hours used, by natural gas, by oil, we see these patterns that reveal different policies and how critical they are to making or not making a climate difference. Then if we look at our transportation footprint, we look at our footprint for goods, services, food, all of this is of course on the website for the conference. All of these things highlight the degree to which we have opportunities. When we look at our cities, many cities have brilliant climate plans. Plan NYC, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Frequently they are planned for the urban core. They leave out the periphery, they leave out the suburbs. That's cheating. Climate doesn't care if you win in the city but lose in the suburbs. We absolutely have to have plans that look at these pimples as they are. A green core surrounded by a red, long commuting suburb is not a solution to this picture. So when we look at opportunities for companies to re-onshore funding they have available in stranded overseas funds they could be putting into clean energy, when we look at the opportunities to invest in clean tech emerging in Kenya, in Mozambique, in Mexico, in Brazil, these are places where our companies can make a huge difference driven by a good policy. Overall, what we find is that there are opportunities across the board to invest in these clean energy opportunities, to do so at prices for energy that are barely different than we expect today, but with huge co-benefits in terms of health, welfare, less time commuting. All of these are opportunities, and we also have to begin at home. We have opportunities everywhere from where I work at the UC system to invest in clean energy, but also to adopt carbon pricing and to move ourselves so that we can join the chorus of divesting from fossil fuels, to finding the opportunities to making these types of investments the place where every company wants to go. And the kind of leadership we've seen in California is exactly what enables that equation. So thank you all for being here, and I hope that we choose not only to listen today, but also to adopt many of these strategies that make this green revolution work. Thank you very much.
Context. Arnold shares the USC Price School's philosophy that public policy is best informed when guided by facts and research. We both share the view that academic research should focus on how it can actually make an influence on real-world problems. So it is very fitting that this symposium includes important academic research that looks at the economic cost of climate change. As policymakers debate the laws that are best to achieve the goals that we seek in reducing greenhouse gases while also protecting jobs in the economy, they need all of the facts. When decision makers often hear arguments claiming climate change is too costly, it is important to have research that also looks at what not addressing climate change would cost. So we're going to have a conversation about this, and it will be moderated by Dr. Dan Mazmanian from the USC Price School. He's a respected expert on environmental policy and was recently appointed as the academic director of the Schwarzenegger Institute. Joining the conversation is Dr. Anthony Westerling from the University of California, Merced, and Dr. Peter Glick, president of the Pacific Institute. We trust that you will find this conversation informative and enlightening. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Dan Mazmanian, and I would like to begin our discussion with a comment about policy and about three kinds of problems that we face in the policy world. I think we're all aware of, but I want to underscore them. There are those problems we face where we know the problem and we have a pretty good idea about how to solve it. There are those we know but don't have a good handle on how to deal with or if solving them is even possible. And then there are those we don't know. The point of this panel is to underscore that we have a reasonable amount of knowledge about the implications of climate change effects on California with respect to, among many issues, sea level rise and forest fires. And although our knowledge is far from perfect in these areas, there are important steps that can and should be taken now in order to avoid potentially very serious economic and other costs of inaction if we fail to do so. With this in mind, I'm going to first welcome to the podium Peter Glick, who is eminently qualified to share with us what is known about sea level rise. Peter.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I'll try not to make any movie jokes, but I have to say I've become an awful great fan of Governor Schwarzenegger, and now you know why, for those of you who heard him this morning. I'm the director of the Pacific Institute, which is a nonprofit research institute in Oakland. Many of you may know the work that we do on fresh water resources. We're doing extensive work now on the drought. We've worked for many years on the issue of climate change, on the risks to California, California's water system, California's coastal systems from climate change. Just a quick comment on the drought. The drought is a climate issue as well. Not only have the last few years been extraordinarily dry, this year may be the hottest year on record for California. So these are connected issues. This is not just a sea level rise issue. It's not just a forest fire issue. This issue of climate change is going to affect everything that we care about. I am going to talk about sea level rise. We did the first assessment at the Institute in 1990 of the risks to the Bay Area from sea level rise. We did a subsequent follow-up a couple of years ago for the state of California, for the entire coast from Oregon down to Mexico, looking at the risks to California of expected and ongoing sea level rise. And my message is fairly simple. Sea level rise changes the fundamental characteristics of the California coast at very great economic cost to us. What we have not measured or cannot measure actually outweighs the kinds of economic costs that we have already measured. So we know to some degree that the costs to the California economy and the public are extraordinarily large from sea level rise, but we also know that we don't know everything, and that many of the costs to us are still not calculated, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And we also know that because of these risks that are ongoing, not a future risk, but a now risk, as John Oliver noted, we have to begin adaptation planning, and we have to begin responses immediately. We have unavoidable changes occurring. No matter what we do on the emissions side, we have to deal with adaptation challenges as well. So quickly, we looked at a whole range of impacts for the coast. And one of the things we quantified was the value of current property at risk from expected sea level rise. The buildings, the contents of those buildings. That assessment alone, which I will argue is the least important probable risk of sea level rise, suggests that there's $100 billion of economic value in buildings and property alone at risk of sea level rise at the 2000 level of development, ignoring the development that we may pursue over the coming decades. And that's only buildings and content. But there are many other things that we have not measured that have a value, economic, social, political, cultural value as well. And we'd better realize that what we measure is not the only part of the picture. There are 480,000 people today living in the areas at risk of sea level rise. Again, ignoring future population growth or what we may choose to do on the coasts. And the vast majority of those people are the poorest populations of the nation and the poorest populations of the state. As Dan Kamen mentioned, this is an environmental justice issue as well. Industrial infrastructure, there are 29 major wastewater treatment plants in the areas at risk. We spend a lot of money collecting wastewater. We treat it to a high standard. We typically throw it away. That's a water issue, which I won't get into. But those plants are typically at sea level, and they're not prepared, they're not built for sea level rise. We have 10,000 megawatts of power plants in the risk zone. Ecosystems. How do you value ecosystem services that might be at risk? We know those values aren't zero. We may have ignored those values in the past century, but in the 21st century, we know that ecosystem values are critical as well, if only we could put dollar figures on them. There are thousands of miles of roads and railways and transportation infrastructure. Next time you cross the Bay Bridge from the East Bay into San Francisco, look at the sea level rise of the roadway there right before the new bridge. What's the cost of rebuilding or protecting infrastructure? What's the cost of retreating from the coast? What's the cost of repeated assaults from extreme events? We're not talking about slow incremental sea level rise. That's going to be damaging enough. But one of the things we learned from Sandy was that it's the extreme events that cost us. What are the costs of repeated extreme events with an incrementally slowly rising sea over time? Ultimately, what's the cost to our economy? We don't really know, but it's going to be very significant. And I love this picture of the 747. That's the San Francisco airport taken from sea level rise. There's major infrastructure at risk here. And I should point this out. We're going to talk about sea level rise, we're going to talk about forestry, but climate change is a big issue and it's going to affect everything we care about. Agricultural production. We're a major agricultural state, and believe me, if there's any part of our economy that's fundamentally dependent on the variability of our climate, or vulnerable to the variability of our climate, it's agriculture. Water supply and delivery. We're losing snowpack. One of the fundamental challenges to the state is impacts on our water systems. Water quality, heat stress. We're going to hear about forest fires, human health, recreation, and others. We have to continue to move forward to understand these risks, to begin to adapt to them, but we can't wait for perfect knowledge to take the actions that we know we need to take. Thank you very much.
I want to next bring up Leroy Westerling. As you heard, he's Associate Professor of Environmental Engineering and Geography at UC Merced, who's a leading expert on the issue of the implications in forest fires through climate change and the implications for the entire Southwest, in particular California. Leroy.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the audience. It's a pleasure to be here, and I have to say it's a pleasure to live in a state that takes such a leadership role on climate change and energy and sustainability. I'm just going to dive in here. So wildfire is an important route by which climate change can affect us, and wildfire today has been increasing in California and the western United States for decades as temperatures increase and the lands dry out. And there's a variety of impacts here that we can consider, from the direct losses of forest products and opportunities for recreation and species habitat, to the property losses of homeowners that are located in or near our forests, and grasslands and shrublands in California that are at risk from wildfire. But then there are also indirect risks. So far more people are impacted by the pollution from wildfire emissions than are directly impacted because they live where the wildfires occur or they visit the areas after they've occurred. You can see in the picture there from the 2003 fire siege in San Diego and Southern California, millions of people living in densely urbanized coastal areas were exposed to pollution for an extended period of time from those fires. And that's true from wildfire regularly in the Central Valley as well. And finally, there's dramatic impacts on our runoff, the quantity, the quality of the water, and emissions and sediment transport, and post-fire flood and mudslide risks. And a lot of these risks are not well quantified, both what their extent is today and how they would change in the future. But we do know a lot about wildfire. So let's talk a bit about how these are going to interact. And I'm going to focus primarily on property losses and emissions from smoke, smoke emissions from wildfire. So in the next slide, I'm showing here the number of large forest fires around the western U.S. on federal lands, year by year. And the horizontal black bars are showing the decadal averages in the number of fires. Now, the area burned in those fires has increased even more. And the red is showing primarily the fires burning in California forests, most of which are federal. And so you can see that it's not the case that fire just increased suddenly, say, in the 1980s, and then it went forward at that level. It's been increasing continuously, year by year, decade by decade, for 30, 40 years now. And it's also the case that the length of the fire season is increasing, and the duration that individual fires are burning has increased as well. West-wide, the increase in the season is over 2/3. And the length of time that fires burn on average has gone from 1 week to over 5 weeks in this period that we're looking at here. So this is really fundamental change in our system. And the cost of fighting these fires per acre has stayed relatively constant over recent decades. So the costs for suppressing these fires on federal lands and state lands have increased, have kept pace with the increase in the area burned. I want to talk a bit about scenarios here. I'm going to show you 3 scenarios initially. So what is on this slide is changes in wildfire area burned under 3 different climate scenarios. So around the end of this century, looking at 3 different climate models. So what's changing across these scenarios is how sensitive the climate system is to the greenhouse gas forcing that we're putting into the atmosphere globally. So the leftmost is the coolest and wettest of the 3 projections, and the rightmost is the warmest and driest. And what I want you to take away from this is that as the state warms up and dries out, you get more and more forest fire area burned in the northern and central mountains of the state. Right? And you actually get decreases when it dries up quite a bit in sort of interior basins and things like that. So these different patterns have different consequences for what kinds of measures we want to take and what kinds of management choices are going to affect different impacts from economic impacts from climate change. And it turns out that for impacts especially, the source of uncertainty that comes from how sensitive the climate system is over time is much less significant than what is the uncertainty about what we will do in the future. And so that's why we always are using scenarios. We're always playing what-if games. We can't give you a number. We have to talk about how things are changing with respect to our actions on the ground. So in this case, most of our development is in lowland areas where it's much less sensitive to climate change and where our risks are things we're building in on the ground right now, where we're siting homes and how we're managing the vegetation around them. In this slide, now we're looking at changes in emissions from wildfire. So pollution emissions from wildfire, in particular here, it's small particulates. So the historic period on the leftmost panel, the emissions are actually dominated by Southern California. By mid-century, this is climate change we're largely committed to that we can't change. We have the central part of the state dominating emissions. And by end of century, if we didn't do anything and we still had the vegetation there to burn, the emission increase would be enormous. The most certain scenario to look at there is the mid-century. So let's zoom in on that and talk about some options here. So the upper left panel is what the historic emissions look like just in the federal areas of the Sierra Nevadas. And the redder parts there are some hot spots where we've had more emissions in the past. Now, if you go to the upper right panel there, that's what it would look like mid-century if you didn't do anything about the fuels. Okay? But we have a lot of forests where fire suppression and land use changes have led to increased fuel densities. So the lower left and lower right panels are just 2 of many fuels treatment scenarios that came from the Forest Service that reduced dramatically the emissions so that in many places, even with substantial climate change, wildfire emissions stay flat or even decrease. And I should point out that these scenarios are not driven by a goal of reducing emissions. They're following other management priorities of the Forest Service in particular. So we could even do much better than this. But we would have to start today because it takes a long time to treat the portion of the landscape that we would have to treat to have this kind of change in our vulnerability. Thank you.
I want to pick up on Leroy's closing comment and field a couple of questions here to both Leroy and Peter. And the first is, can you provide us 1 or 2 notable examples of action that is being taken to address what you've identified as the existing but also looming costs of either major forest fires or sea level rise? And who would like to begin?
I can address that if you like. So we have a long-term commitment from the federal government in particular, but also at state levels, to treat fuels in forests that have been altered by fire suppression and land use changes. But those resources have to compete often with the need for money for fire suppression. So for example, the Forest Service is spending over $1 billion a year on fire suppression in the western United States right now. And so that increase that they've had in the fire suppression because of increased fires has meant that their budget has gone from a 16% allocation for fire suppression to over 42%. And everything else has stayed flat or declined at the same time. So the capacity to treat fuels has been limited and decreasing.
Peter.
So there are a couple of points to make. One is I think we're not doing enough to prepare for the impacts we know are coming. We are beginning to do things. We're beginning to look at what we call no-regret strategies, co-benefits, the idea of cutting fuel load. Whether or not climate change happens, that's something you want to do for forest protection and forest fire reduction. But there are things that we ought to be doing on top of that because of sea level rise expectations, because of climate broadly. We are beginning to change design of coastal infrastructure so that we're planning not just for today's sea level rise, but for sea level rise over the coming decades. I think that's critical. Let me give you one water example, actually. Sacramento, as many of you know who live in Sacramento, is vulnerable to flooding events on the American River. Folsom Dam is upstream. Some recent modifications to the infrastructure at Folsom have permitted them to dump water more quickly out of Folsom in the event of big storm events. But what that means is not only flood protection, but they can store more water longer in Folsom, which is a drought response as well. And given the changes of climate and snowpack in the Sierras, that kind of change to existing infrastructure provides flood benefits now, drought benefits now, and climate benefits in the future. So we need to think about these kind of co-benefits and how to capture them.
So what I hear from both of you in response is that although climate change is going to exacerbate the kinds of problems we've been experiencing, both of you commented about how to simply enhance the kinds of responses we currently have, if I understand what you're saying. So what 2 or 3 key steps might be taken now in terms of policy and the audience we're here with today that you can foresee we should be taking as a state in enhancing our capacities?
Well, I think that I touched on the 2 main ones already, and that is that we need to think about how new development, its siting, how it's constructed, how the vegetation around it is managed, builds in vulnerability to climate change via wildfires. And fires really should be like any other sort of natural process where it happens and we live with it. And we shouldn't have to spend $100 million plus in California and $1 billion in the federal government to put them out every year. That money should be going into managing the landscape.
Yeah, I agree with this issue of development. We're not very good about thinking about the way we develop. We never have been. We need to now integrate climate change risks into development along the coast, for example. The kinds of development we permit along the coast, if we don't expect sea level rise, is going to be different than the kind of development we ought to permit now that we understand that sea level rise is going up. So planning and development is one critical thing. I would argue we need to change the way we design our insurance programs in coastal protection and flood protection. Insurance programs provide incentives or disincentives for certain kinds of development. And I think we need to change the way we protect ecosystems. We know that ecosystems are enormously at risk from sea level rise. So not only do we have to think about current wetlands, but we need to think about the undeveloped lands immediately adjacent to ecosystems that are going to be threatened, that we might need to retreat to, that have ecosystem value. So we think about protecting coastal ecosystems, but we think less well, if you will, about protecting neighboring lands that might be of especially important value from an ecosystem point of view. And I think that's going to be a change in thinking also.
So you're leading to my next question, and it relates to why we're up here as a panel, and beginning with Arnold's comments about research and Jack Knott's about our responsibilities contributing to solutions and proposals. And I want to come back to what I commented at the beginning. Of the problems we know, but we know less about, which 1 or 2 are most in need of attention by the research community today?
So I think it's one thing to say that you need to treat X% of the landscape and you need to restore a healthy forest structure and density. It's another thing to actually do it on the ground. And I think that there's probably not going to be one best way to do it that works everywhere. And the reasons why things work well, we may not know until long after the fact. So we really need to take some kind of portfolio approach where we try different things on landscape in different places and hedge our bets, and then watch and see what happens afterwards and learn from it. And I think one of the things that we have to be really paying attention to are interactive effects. When you have wildfire and, say, insect outbreaks, and you're doing these management treatments on the landscape to change the fuel structure and things like that, how do those things interact with each other? We don't do that kind of research very much. And that's something that where all the surprises are probably going to come from.
Yes, we always talk about doing that kind of research, but it's seldom done. Peter.
I'm a researcher. I think there are plenty of things that need to be tackled. I think there are plenty of things we don't know. We need to know a lot more, especially about extreme events. Extreme events are really where we're most vulnerable. And I think there's a lot to be learned from events like Sandy, which was an extreme event in the extreme, if you will, and taught us about our failure to make investments in advance to address coastal risks. But I would also like to, I'd probably leave us with the message that despite what we don't know, we know enough. We know enough now to be taking actions that we're not yet taking. The risks of climate change, again, aren't a future risk. They're a risk happening now. We see evidence all around us of impacts of climate change, from rising seas to rising temperatures to changing snowfall and snowmelt dynamics in the Sierras to impacts on our water systems to forest frequency. There's a lot that we ought to be doing now rather than waiting for more knowledge to convince those few, those 3%ers who still haven't quite gotten the message.
You know, there's a lot to be discussed in terms of this kind of research and what as academics and researchers we should be doing, but I want to just conclude, because we are out of time, but would underscore what Peter said here, which is among the academic community, the researchers, while we appreciate the extent of uncertainty in all these areas, there is a growing body of knowledge that we do have a consensus about, which is acting now, irrespective of the immediate costs, is going to be far less costly in not only dollars, but in the well-being of Californians in the future. And I think that's the message of this panel. So I want to thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.